Hey folks, so we're beginning module 2, which focuses on another type of tissue that trees and shrubs and lianas have. This is reproductive tissue, and so all of the lectures in this unit have to do with reproductive tissue. And so in angiosperms, that's flowers and also fruit. And in gymnosperms, we'll talk about those as well. So that talks about cones. And those are all the focus for lecture 2. So today we're going to talk about flower and fruit arrangements, right? So since you've already had leaf arrangements, you understand that this is how fruits and flowers are arranged on individual species of trees. Okay, so first I want to start with the tree topic, something of interest. So what is Raleigh known as? So Raleigh is the city of oaks. If you're new to Raleigh, you might not have known that. And then I want to, Raleigh is a Tree City USA and NC State is a Tree Campus USA. So I'm curious to know what ecosystem services do trees provide in urban areas? So I'll give you a chance to think about that and write down some ideas. So among other things, trees provide stormwater control. Their roots take up water. They sequester carbon. They filter air pollution. They reduce urban heat, right? You probably have heard of the urban heat island effect, that urban areas tend to be hotter than other places. They certainly contribute to aesthetics. That's something that's a little bit more intangible, and also land value. And I think this is pretty interesting. There's an article here by NPR last year looking at urban heat islands and correlating the amount of tree cover with income. And so in studying multiple cities around the United States, they have found that the fewer trees that are in urban areas, the lower the income. And so let's see if they actually did evaluate Raleigh. And so if we look at this heat and income in Raleigh, North Carolina, you can see up at the very top that census tracts in Raleigh displayed only a slight correlation between heat and income, right? So looking at the dark red areas, those are looking at areas of that are warmer, right? This is not a surprise, right? The darkest area is in the middle of downtown Raleigh. But then if you look at the median income, looking at minimum, medium, and maximum income, you can see, well, there's a very wealthy area right there in the, not exactly the center of Raleigh, but you can see that there is only a slight correlation. So the more urban areas do have fewer trees, but it's not a very close correlation of those two factors in Raleigh, but it is in other areas. And I think that's interesting because there is also a competing issue of gentrification. And so there's evidence that some communities, when you go through a rigorous tree planting campaign, that raises home values in the area, and then that often pushes the original residents out. So it's a really complex issue. But trees really do provide a lot of services in urban areas. And I think a lot of us sort of walk around, this is kind of related to plant blindness again, that we walk around thinking of trees as kind of decorative features in the landscape, but they really contribute a lot to health, and which is why I really want you all to spend some time outdoors this semester learning trees, even though our class is now online. So looking at this lecture outline, so I don't know if you've ever received an edible arrangement, we're going to look at this slightly differently. So we're going to talk about fruit and flower arrangement, and then two different types of growth for reproductive tissue, indeterminate and determinate, and different types within there. And we'll have lots of examples from each. So you'll see kind of a diagram of what each one looks like that will help you understand the definition. And then we'll look at some examples. And then we'll also look at other fruit arrangements that aren't covered. So when you're talking about flowers, they can have different parts, right? So perfect flowers, and this might be reviewed for some of you, perfect flowers contain both sexes, male and female, in the same flower, right? So if you think about your typical, if you took Botany 200 or Plant Biology 200, you may have learned that, flowers have pistils and stamens, right? The female and male parts in the same flower. There's usually a lily diagram to show those parts contained in the same flower. But it's actually pretty common in trees to have imperfect flowers. So they can have male or female parts in one flower, but they're not in the same flower. So they may have two different types in the same species in the same individual. And those are called monoecious, right? So this flower type is more common in trees that are in the temperate zone, which is where we are in Raleigh, North Carolina. So monoecious trees have separate male and female flowers on the same individual, right? So this is a very common occurrence, right, where you have separate male and female flowers. That's true of maples. Sometimes you have to look very carefully to notice that they are actually separate male and female flowers. And then you have examples of dioecious trees, and they have separate male and female flowers that are on different individuals. So you have male trees and female trees, and monoecious and dioecious is one house versus two house. That's the Latin root, if that's something that's familiar to you. And if you think about the evolutionary advantages of these different flowers, right, one of the issues with perfect flowers is that you risk selfing, right? So you risk having being self-pollinated, and there are some mechanisms to prevent that. Some pollen will not take root on a flower, on its own flower, but has to be spread. But when you have groves of trees, right, you have more genetic diversity if you have the flowers separated either within the same tree, as in monoecious, or on separate trees in dioecious. So that could be an advantage. Of course, one thing that a lot of horticulturists think about, so for example, I just planted winterberry a couple of years ago, and they told me that I need to make sure I have a male because people purchase different species of ilex for their fruits, but those are for the females, and the males are necessary, otherwise they'll produce less fruit. So if you're buying a dioecious tree for your yard because you want to have the fruit, you need to make sure you get at least one male, because that'll increase the fruit production. So a couple of examples of this. So perfect flowers. So this is a great photograph. If you haven't noticed one before, or if you never connected it with the species, Liriodendron tulipifera, tulip tree, or yellow poplar. The flower is at the top. So if you didn't know why it was called tulipifera, now you can really see that it has these really lovely tulip-like flowers. But male and female parts are in the same flower. So and then examples of monoecious species and genera with monoecious flowers include Caria, the hickories, as well as oaks, quercus. And then examples of species with dioecious flowers include ilex, as I mentioned, the hollies, rhus, which is sumac, diospyros, which is persimmon, and ginkgo. So if we look at fruit and flower arrangements, right? So this is how that fruits and flowers are arranged on a stem. And so you can either have them clustered at the end, right, which would be called terminal at the end of a twig, or they can be axillary, where they're contained above a leaf or a bract. And so if you look at the example in the diagram on the left, that would be an example of axillary fruits or flowers. You can't really tell if it looks like flowers. And then on the right is an example of a terminal, right? So it's the flower or inflorescence is at the end. And so when we talk about flowers, we often use the word inflorescence, which is a cluster of flowers. Some flowers do occur singly, but more often they're in an inflorescence. So they're in a cluster or group of flowers. And then likewise, right, when you talk about a cluster of fruits, like a group, like a bunch of grapes, right, we would call that an infructescence. So an infructescence is a cluster of fruits. And here's a couple of examples. So you can see on the left is a type of ilex or holly, if those look like holly berries. I'm guessing that's Ilex decidua. And so you can see the fruits that are clustered at the ends of the branches. And then on the right side is an example of a species we will learn later this semester called Calocarpa americana, American beautyberry. And you can see that the stem extends above the cluster of fruits. So this is an example of axillary fruits. So fruits clustered along the edge. And this is very distinctive and easy to see. So it's a useful character for identification. Also, examples of fruits that you might be familiar with on the left, we have Caria illinoinensis, right? Your pecan, right? And you can see those winged sutures that go along the length of the oval nut. And then you can also see on the right, those are fruits for calorie pair, which we didn't see, we might have seen those in lab, but you can see they're at axillary, that they're at the axils of the leaves. So, right, we're talking about inflorescences and infructescences and looking at the different parts of this, right? We have the flower or fruit at the end, okay? And then we have the parts, the stem that attaches that flower or fruit is called the pedicel, right? So, and then sometimes they have bracts or leaf tissue that are at the base of those. So that's something that you can look for. Those can be diagnostic. And then the stem that attaches the inflorescence to the twig is called the peduncle. So the pedicel is the stalk that bears the individual flowers, right? So often flowers are in a cluster. And then the peduncle supports the entire inflorescence. And those words are also true for fruits, right? So the part of the plant does not change names just because the flower has now developed into a fruit. So we can also think about fruits and flowers in terms of growth types. And there's two different kinds. One is indeterminate. And that's when you have flowers, and that's shown on the right by this beautiful obedient plant, Physistasia, that I photographed in my yard last year. So when flowers in the cluster open from the bottom to the top, or from the outside in for a more rounded flower cluster, and there's no terminal flower. So if you look at that photo on the right, it's a little bit blurry towards the top, but there's no end to the flower stalk. And in fact, it will continue to grow, right? It starts flowering from the bottom up and it will continue to flower until the growing season is over. You can have determinate flowers, and that's when the cluster forms a terminal flower first, and then the flowers open from the top to the bottom or from the inside to the outside. So that's where you would have the flowers at the top open first, and then it would lower down along the stem. So, and I want to talk about that just a little bit more. So why would that, what are the advantages of each of those? So if you think about it, right, the flower puts a lot of energy into reproductive tissue and reproduction in general. And so when it's determinate, there's a set amount of energy that's put into that growth, right? So you set seed and you're done for the year. Now, if the growing season is variable, it might be an advantage to grow indeterminately, because as long as the conditions allow, you can continue to put out more flowers and get more fruit. And so in temperate climates, at least, it would be perhaps advantageous to have an indeterminate growth. That way, that Physistasia plant, that obedient plant, can continue to grow. The tip continues to grow, right? Because that's the apical meristem. And it continues to flower and fruit long into the season if for some reason we get a late frost. So it's kind of the put your eggs into one basket or versus taking a risk. So indeterminate fruit types are much more common in trees in our flora. And there's 6 fruit types that I want to focus on. And I'm going to define each of those in the next slides and give you some examples of each. So we have spike, catkin, raceme, umbel, and panicle. And so there's some drawings there, but let's look at these in turn. So when we have a spike, right, remember the word rachis that we used for leaves. That was the stem that bears leaves in a compound leaf, or bears leaflets in a compound leaf. In this case, the rachis bears sessile flowers and fruits. And so you can see there's no, peduncle, right? No stem that attaches the flowers to that rachis. They're attached directly. And so one example of this is black willow or Salix nigra. This is one we've had, although we're not able to fall, so we will not see that in flower. But you can see from the photograph that the flowers are sessile and they're attached directly to that rachis. We have an example of a catkin. This is a flexible rachis, so it's a little bit, it's not as stiff as a normal rachis. And so it's flexible enough that it droops under its own weight and also has sessile flowers, but these flowers are same-sex only. So that means these flowers are either monoecious or dioecious. And this is a common trait in members of the Betulaceae, so our Carpinus caroliniana. also Morris, which is shown here. So this is an example of a female catkin, right? So this is monoecious, would be found on the same tree. And you can see that those little pistils, right? It looks like a little ovary, and we'll get to flower parts at a later lecture, but they are attached directly to that rachis, which in this case is flexible. And those will then develop into the fruits, which we'll look at in just a little bit. Another example, these are the male catkins on Ulmus cerulata. So this is a species we will learn. And then we have a raceme, right? So again, this has that growth form where there's a central rachis, but instead of the flowers being attached directly, like a spike, they're attached on little stems or peduncles, or pedicels rather, that have these individual flower stalks. They're about the same length. And so they end up making a inflorescence that is, again, long and tapered towards the end. You can also see that indeterminate growth form, right, where the largest flowers are the ones that are opening first, that are down at the bottom of that rachis. And then as you get towards the top, you can see that these are still developing buds. So let's look at an example of this. This is Virginia Sweetspire, or Itea virginica. This is a wetland obligate plant. We might learn it this semester. And you can see that central rachis, right, that is attached. And then you can even see the little pedicels that are attaching those little fruits to that central stalk. So that's something, we saw another example of that in Oxydendrum arboreum, or sourwood, that those little fruits each have their own little pedicels that attach to the rachis. Okay, are you getting a hang of this vocabulary? So let's look at umbels. So this is where you have a central point, and the flowers arise from this central point, and pedicels are about the same length. And so what that results in is that the fruit, the infructescence or inflorescence, has kind of a flat top to it. And there's lots of examples of these. Interestingly and importantly, because this is indeterminate growth, right, where it will continue to add flowers as the season extends, the flowers, it flowers from the outside to the inside. So it will continue to grow flower stalks as long as the weather is good. Classic example of this is members of the carrot family, which includes Queen Anne's lace and also onions or allium. Let's look at some pictures of these. This is in the allium family, and you can see all those really long pedicels that are emerging from that central point. And in this case, it's kind of a ball-like appearance. This is also common in species of milkweed. And then a second example, right, looking at the compound umbel, right? So that's like an umbel that has little umbels attached to it. And these are, Apiaceae is the carrot family. So Queen Anne's lace is a very common roadside weed, one that we have seen flowering throughout the summer. Daucus carota. Continuing with our indeterminate fruit types, you can also have a panicle, right? Now, if you look at one of those individual inflorescences in that group or cluster, you can see it's basically a raceme, right? So this is an example of a compound fruit or inflorescence. And so you have these clusters of individual racemes borne on a central stem, right? So it's branched. And the panicle refers to the entire flower head or inflorescence or infructescence. On the right, we see an infructescence of sumac, which is Rhus, in this case, Rhus copalinum. And this is a species we should learn at some point during this semester. You can't see the individual pedicels, but because they're kind of hidden under those fruits. And then another classic example of a panicle is Joe Pye weed, Eutrichium fistulosum. This is a beautiful native plant. Pollinators love it, and you can see that there are, right, the inflorescence has racemes that are attached to that central stem, so making a compound inflorescence. And it will continue to lengthen and grow throughout as long as it can until the frost. Okay, so those are all of the indeterminate flowering and fruiting types. We have one example that is found in trees in our flora called a cyme. And on this diagram, it's in the center, the lowest row in the center. Although that's not what it always looks like on trees. That's more common in wildflowers. So let's look at a cyme, because a cyme looks a little bit like what? Looks like an umbel, right? And in this case, because it's determinate, right, the first thing that flowers is the center, right? That's where the oldest flower is, and then it will continue to add flowers around the outside, but the number is determined right at the outset. So an example of a cyme is, from a species we already learned, is elderberry, Sambucus canadensis. And it's hard to see from that photo, but the oldest flowers have finished in the center, and then it still has open flowers around the edge. And another kind of cyme that we can find in our flora are viburnums. So we've only learned prunifolium so far, and I don't think that one on campus had fruits, but there are lots of viburnums in our flora. We're on the search for them. And so remember, those central fruits open the center and then they build on the outside. So, or they tend to flower and fruit all at once. That's the other, right? So it's predetermined how many fruits there will be at the outset of development. And you can look again and see that that viburnums have an opposite leaf arrangement. This particular one is a wetland plant called Viburnum cassinoides, or wild raisin. And so here's another example of elderberry, right? Another photo of elderberry, Sambucus canadensis, with the oldest flowers in the middle that are already opened and the ones on the outside having just opened. So we have other compound fruit types or arrangements, and so we can break those down. You've probably already seen examples on your lab sheets of aggregates, multiples. I don't think we've talked about heads or capitulums, but we will. So we can have an aggregate fruit when you have multiple fruits developing from a single flower and in very, very tight clusters. So it looks like a single entity. And the supporting stalks are not evident. So they're just all attached together. So it looks like one fruit. And so the example we have, and I don't know if you saw these in lab, but the mature fruit of Liriodendron tulipifera, you can see on the left side, right, you have the fruit in the middle. It's an aggregate of samaras. And you can see surrounding it from the outside are the male stamens. Okay, so that's a very, very long stamens that surround the center ovary, which develops into the fruit. More on that later. We're going to talk lots about flower and fruit morphology. And then you can see on the right that those male parts have fallen off and you're left with this aggregate of samaras. So this all developed from a single flower. If you think back to the flower on a previous slide, you can see it's a single flower that developed into this aggregate fruit. We have multiples as well. And so this is when you have fruits developing from many flowers in close proximity, right? So each of those, if you look at this white mulberry, right, Morus alba, in the photo, you can see a little dot in the center of each of them, one of those. That is the end of the flower, right? So the flower is now developed into the fruit. So the flowers are very clustered together, but it's many flowers form multiple fruits. And we have that happen in sweet gum. And also the other example we saw is Cephalanthus occidentalis. And so you can see on the left, there's that creepy COVID-19 flower. And each of those little structures that is pointing out is an individual flower. It's the pistil of an individual flower. And so when you look on the right, so you have a multiple that is developed into fruits. So you can see those are little clusters of fruits, but they look like a single entity. So we call it a multiple. Sweet gum is another example of that, where they're actually fused together. And yes, this is the creepy fruit of 2020. You can have a head or capitulum. This is a specific type of multiple. So when you learn sweet gum, we'll teach it as a multiple, I think it's a multiple of achenes. And you can see that there are multiple fruits that are on a common receptacle. So in the photo on the right, I always love seeing trees at different times of the year so you can see their development. So you can see the flower cluster, the head up above that's in green. You can see the developing leaves, the little star-shaped leaves, and those are all individual flowers that are clustered together. And then when the fruits develop, you can see one that's hanging down that sort of lets you see the transition between the flowering and the fruiting. Those are all fused together, and so they make us what looks like a single fruit, but we would call it a multiple, and in this case, a head or capitulum. So it's a specific type of multiple. And then lastly, I'll wrap up with a photo I took at tree camp the other week. This is not a woody plant, but you should be seeing a lot of the fruits around. This is pokeweed, which has a traditional use in food called poke salad. Most of this plant is poisonous. Almost every part of it is poisonous, but if you're an herbalist and know how to prepare it, it has medicinal use. And so look carefully and tell me what fruit or flower type does that have? What is the fruit arrangement? What is that called? Okay, so we have learned about the flower and fruit arrangement, where flowers are located on the stem, whether they're terminal or axillary, flowers and flower types, and then the entire structure, which we would call an inflorescence or an infructescence. We learned about the 6 different types of indeterminate fruit and flowers that we find in trees. And then for determinate types, there's only one, cymes, that is common in our flora. And I will wrap up with a little literary reference here. So what tree is it that grows in Brooklyn, and a tree grows in Brooklyn? Remember, this tree was all about resilience, and I looked at this old cover of this novel by Betty Smith, and it does look like the tree that it is, which we are learning in lab this week. And it is, in fact, Ailanthus altissima, tree of heaven. Does that surprise you? Shouldn't, right? Because we learned that Ailanthus is something that can thrive in urban environments. So getting back to these urban trees that were planted. And I have a quote here from the author, Betty Smith. If there was only one tree like that in the world, you would think it was beautiful. But because there are so many, you just can't see how beautiful it really is. So it's just I'm just going to wrap up with a call to look around you and see trees for what they really are, and the beauty that they have. And that's a wrap.